Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't we get started? Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the good fortune of directing our environmental change and security program. It is our distinct pleasure to be partnering today and the host of a launch of a new report that Oxfam and CNA have done together, a notable partnership that I'll say a word about in a minute. But we're here to talk about the report, An Ounce of Prevention, Preparing for the Impact of a Changing Climate on U.S. Humanitarian and Disaster Response. I hope you all had a chance to pick up a copy of the report outside. Those of you watching online, I'm sure you're able to find it, the URL link for it as well, so hope that you access it there. It is our distinct pleasure to be facilitating this discussion, or hosting this discussion of the report and this partnership, because we here at the Wilson Center in the Environmental Change and Security Program have been tackling the issues of environment, including climate change, and trying to understand them in a security context. And so it's our distinct pleasure to have these worlds coming together, both in the institutions of Oxfam and CNA, two a development NGO on the one hand, and CNA working closely with the security community on the other. And it really is a notable partnership. And frankly, given the challenges we face in climate change, it's the kind of all-hands-on-deck mentality that, frankly, we need to adopt. And kind of staying in our lanes is a luxury that is one that perhaps we have to really re-examine and find ways that we can learn from one another, which I think this report reflects, and just the very process of them working together reflects. So we're really thrilled to see that here at the Wilson Center, because it has been very much our mission to help try to bring these communities together. As I think many of you know, the Wilson Center is the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president. He was our only president to have a PhD, so Congress in 1968 thought it fitting to have these two worlds come together and learn from one another in a living memorial, rather than building an obelisk on the mall that we'd go get our pictures taken in front of. So it is on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis that we facilitate exactly these kinds of discussions for the community here in Washington, but notably because we're able to webcast the event live and then archive that video for colleagues and the wider public in the United States and, in fact, around the world. And so we urge you to share the insights from today through that means with other colleagues as we go forward. I should say it also is notable we have been blessed with a transition from one terrific leader to another. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton has stepped down at the end of this last year, and former Congresswoman Jane Harman left Congress to join us, which was a thrill from our perspective. And so, Jane, it's terrific to see you here today as well. We're going to get on with the program then. I should say one final word of introduction. Another reason that this is a thrill for us to hear from Ed and Mark and then the panel is that it fits very much in terms of some of the work that we're doing with USAID and their Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, our Resources for Peace initiative. And we'll hear from USAID on these topics as well in terms of our discussant panel. But let me stop talking and turn it over to our stars. We have Mark Cohen, who's a senior researcher on humanitarian policy and climate change at Oxfam. Mark is a longtime friend of the center, someone we've published in the Environmental Change and Security Program when he's at IFPRI, and so it's terrific to have him come back again to grace our stage. And Ed McGrady is a senior research analyst at CNA, where he is really a leading innovator in using games and scenarios. One of, for me, an example of where the broader climate change development and scientific community, activist community, can really take some lessons from the security community in terms of tools that can be applicable in very productive ways. And so it's terrific to have Ed here, and turn the floor over to Ed for our first remarks.
Well, thank you. And I want to say it's been a real privilege working with Mark and David and Oxfam in general on this, to try to get a better handle on how climate change is going to affect the future for disaster response and humanitarian assistance operations, both for the whole of government as well as in particular for the military. And we took sort of a three-part approach to this. The first thing we try to do is understand how climate change is going to affect humanitarian assistance and disaster response missions in the future. Then what we try to do is we try to understand what we do today in terms of humanitarian response and disaster assistance. For example, we have at CNA a very large database of all the missions and all the operations the military is engaged on for humanitarian assistance and disaster response. So we look through that to try to understand what it is we currently do so we can say, okay, if climate change is going to affect these operations in the following ways, this is how it's going to affect the military and how it operates. And finally, we try to then synthesize those two and understand what this future environment is going to look like, both for the U.S. military, which was where I concentrated, as well as for the whole government interagency approach, which is what Mark's going to talk about from Oxfam's perspective. Well, the first thing, whoops.
I think we may just need to switch a file.
My briefing is not here.
Should be there someplace.
This one right here, I believe.
There we go.
Well, the first thing we did is we did a literature search, and we looked through both the scientific literature in a fair degree of detail, as well as things like the IPCC reports and other sources to try to understand where, when, how much, how intense various kinds of humanitarian assistance as well as natural disasters are going to change in the future. And as you might expect, we didn't find, particularly from a military perspective, where you're trying to identify specific requirements, we need 3 more ships or we need 10 more tanks. We didn't find that kind of specificity in the climate change literature. But what we did find is some general principles that we really think are going to drive future considerations for how both the military as well as the whole of government may participate in operations in the future. And some examples include things like tropical storms are predicted to increase in intensity. That's very relevant for the military because the military tends to respond preferentially to high-intensity storm events. So it may actually have an increase in its operations in the future. Patterns of weather activity may change. For example, fire may change both its intensity as well as the places where it's currently burning. If those are the cases, you may see shifts in the requirements for the military or the requirements for the whole of government to be able to respond to these kind of disasters. And finally, and most significantly, we found that the economic and social stresses from things like agricultural disruptions, migration, and all the other things that are generally associated with climate change will produce additional stress on already marginal societies. That will have a profound effect on how the security environment evolves, and it will in turn have a profound effect on how everybody, from the government to NGOs to the military, becomes involved in responding to these events. So the bottom line from our search on how things are going to change in the future is we see this confluence of changes in the climate will induce changes in the patterns and the nature of disasters, as well as a change in the social structures, particularly for fragile or already marginal societies, will create security issues. So it's kind of this confluence of disasters and security that really makes for a very interesting set of analyses for how things are going to change in the future. Well, what are we doing right now? Well, if you look at the trends in disaster response, humanitarian assistance for either the whole of government or, as the case what we show here, for just reported natural disasters, there's been a tendency for disasters and humanitarian assistance requirements to increase over the last 2 decades, both for just the reported ones, for the UN responses, for the U.S. responses, and for the military responses. In addition, the cost has been increasing, with a lot of the cost centered in complex emergencies or emergencies where there's some sort of underlying social, economic, or military situation with respect to disaster, not just the disaster itself. And that contributes a significant amount to the overall cost profile for these kind of disasters. And one of the things we started asking ourselves is, well, as things change, it looks like there's going to be more stress placed on the system, stress in terms of both the number of operations as well as the cost of the operation. So it began to occur to us, and Mark's going to talk a lot more about this in a bit, how do we mitigate these? How do we prepare now for a world where there's going to be these additional stresses on us? Well, and specifically, I looked at the U.S. military and said, okay, what has the military been engaged in? And more importantly, why have we sent U.S. military forces in response to humanitarian assistance and disaster response operations? We don't go to every possible operation. There are hundreds every year around the world. We only go to a select few. And other than the size of the disaster, the larger disasters tend to get attention. I didn't really find any correlation in particular between political party, between particular year. It just tends to depend on the current geopolitical climate and the current policy decisions by the U.S. government, which tend to be driven by a lot of different factors. For example, sometimes Japan will ask us in, as they did with Tomoguchi, and other times Japan might not ask us in, as they did with the Kobe earthquake. So things like that tend to drive military interventions as much as need or as much as politics. But one of the things is, when you start looking through the data as to when and why and where the military intervenes, there's a few things that really stand out. And the first one is the military can do a lot of things. It has construction equipment, it has doctors, it has food, but the unique things it does boil down to a relatively small set of activities. They include heavy lift, and by that I mean helicopters, sea transport, all-terrain ground transport, things like that can reach areas and reach and deliver aid in areas where the transportation network has been disrupted. In addition, it has theater logistics. It can move equipment, it can move personnel, and it can move supplies into the theater very quickly in the event of a disaster, and then be able to offload those when the infrastructure such as ports or airfields have been disrupted. Also, it has the command and control capacity. It has the ability to do things like they did in Haiti, where you go in and the airport's been disrupted, so you have an airport in a box and you set it up and reestablish operations at the airfield very quickly. It has the ability to do communications as well as command in environments where it's been disrupted. But if you look at the current situation with respect to NGOs and the UN, a lot of these capabilities, including things like heavy lift, are already being developed by independent civilian organizations. So even these capabilities within the military aren't necessarily unique. But the one capability the military has that is relatively unique is its ability to provide security operations. In addition, Western militaries can provide both offensive and defensive security operations in order to preempt threats before they actually occur. So if the military is going to be affected by anything, the security situation is really going to drive a lot of those requirements, because if the security situation goes, then the military may be one of your best and only recourses for certain security environments. So as security becomes more important in the future, we may see more of a demand function. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to compare both what we do now, what the capabilities are from the military and the whole of government, to the projected impacts of climate change, and to try to understand what might we be asked to do in the future. Even though we can't develop specific requirements at this time, we can at least certainly say there's certain kind of missions, or there's certain kind of activities that you may be engaged in. What we found is that there's really a unique set of challenges, and I think there's a fairly interesting set of things that the whole of government and the U.S. military can do now to start preparing for it. One of the things we see is that if you plot the countries, like we're doing here, where the countries in dark red are the most fragile states, if you plot state fragility against the world, and then you overlay climate change, you'll see that many of the most fragile countries are in that region of Africa, Central America, and Asia, where climate change is predicted to have its most significant impacts. So if you're already starting with fragile states, or even a region where there's a substantial number of fragile countries such as Africa, you may begin to lose the country's ability to respond to or be able to adapt to disasters. And then you may also be able to lose the regional ability to be able to adapt to it. This points to a significantly increased signal function for military as well as whole of government responses to disasters. What we found, looking at all the various types of disasters and how they may change, as well as the U.S. military's, what it does, is that emergencies really will do one of three things. One is they will evolve, and tropical storms are a very good example of that. Higher intensity tropical storms will result in a marginally larger number of tropical storms the military may have to respond to. But responding to tropical storm events is something it does now on a fairly routine basis for its version of disaster response. However, there are other missions that may emerge, fire being a particular example. If fires become more intense overseas or change their location where they're burning, then the U.S. military, which does a lot of domestic fire response but doesn't do much overseas fire response right now, may see that as a mission that becomes more prevalent in the future. And then finally, I have this category of surprise. We don't know everything about how climate change is going to evolve, and in particular, when we look at this equation of the disasters are changing, the underlying economic and social conditions are changing, and this is all connected to climate change. We don't know how that equation is going to balance out, and there may be changes in why we do the mission. If there are changes in why we commit the U.S. military, or for that matter, the whole of government to the mission, it becomes increasingly difficult to predict in the future what we're going to be doing, what the signal demand function is going to be, and so forth. We think the U.S. military has a role to play, though. In addition to the security function, where if you have, again, this increased fragility, increased stress, plus the fact that there are disasters, you'll have more demand signal for the military to do security operations. And in fact, currently there's the term complex humanitarian operations, where you have humanitarian operations in areas where there's instability, where there's fighting, where there's economic decline, not so much with natural disasters right now. In the future, with an increasing number of fragile or failed or damaged states, in addition to an increasing number of disasters, the likelihood of a natural disaster occurring in a security environment increases. We term those complex disaster response operations, and the military may engage in more of those in the future. Second of all, and I think this is certainly not least, this is something the military can really contribute that I think is a really important feature, and that's planning for complex contingencies. Nassim Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan, and that's about events that you don't even know you're supposed to be predicting. The military is very good at thinking through long-term contingencies, radical contingencies that you may not necessarily be a likely occurrence, but if it happens, it will really hurt you. The military has a lot of these planning capabilities and organizing for how to do that it can bring to the interagency and really help structure the interagency's thinking on a lot of these issues. And we think that's a very important potential contribution. So what is the impact of the increasing climate-related disasters? Well, we see this equation of need plus stress plus instability to be equal to greater demand, because particularly for the military, greater security situations, and also greater cost for both the whole of government in terms of the number of operations as well as the nature of the operations. If you have to go into a security environment, it's going to cost you more even if you don't have the U.S. military. This equation really asks the question, how do we prevent this? How do we help mitigate this now so we don't have to pay this bill in the future? And what we came up with, both Oxfam and CNA, are two key things. One is to increase the efficiency of aid delivery. If we increase our efficiency, we're doing more with less. In the future, that may become very important as we try to do more with less. The second thing is really reducing the demand function now by increasing the resilience, particularly in some of these already marginal or close to marginal or fragile societies, where if you build their capacity to conduct disaster response operations, maybe not even in the country, but potentially in the region, you're building in what we call an ounce of prevention. An ounce of prevention now is really worth a pound of cure in the future. And now Mark's going to talk about some of the specifics of how we work these various solutions within the whole of government approach, not just for the military.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you, Jeff, for that very nice introduction. So, keeping in mind these points here that Ed has brought up, first of all, the need for leadership and coherence so that we can have effectiveness and efficiency, and then second, looking at prevention rather than reactive response, we find that the overall humanitarian system of the United States and globally, we find, particularly on the U.S. side, some major strengths and also some key weaknesses. So, to talk about the strengths, first of all, most U.S. humanitarian response is by civilian agencies, both governmental, non-governmental, including our organization Oxfam, and increasingly there's a private sector role as well. The United States is the largest donor of humanitarian assistance. So it plays a key role in most humanitarian response, typically providing 40 to 50% of total resources in a given year, and sometimes a higher percentage depending on the emergency, where it is, and why. There are a number of agencies involved on the civilian side within the U.S. government. This slide shows you three of the key ones, two from the U.S. Agency for International Development. First of all, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which is, I think, one of the most highly regarded government agencies. It's considered very competent, effective, nimble. It is supposed to be the lead agency in disaster responses, at least in theory. And it has a military liaison officer program, so it manages civilian-military relationships and how to sort out a good response. So in terms of coherent leadership, the potential is there through OFDA. There's also the Office of Food for Peace at USAID, which manages food aid and this is a very significant part of humanitarian response, between $1 and $2 billion a year. So major resources provided in that way. And finally, the PRM Bureau at the State Department, Population, Refugees, and Migration, provides funding, and the U.S. is the largest funder of key global humanitarian agencies, multilateral agencies like the International Organization for Migration, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. So clearly some strengths there. But turning to some of the weaknesses, I'd like to focus on six. First, at the global level, very critical weakness of the humanitarian system, and that is shortfalls in funding. Globally, we find that when the UN issues a humanitarian appeal, donors, the United States and others, are providing during this 5-year period of 2005 to 2009 only about 70% of what's requested. And last year, 2010, that figure fell below 2/3 to about 63%. So first of all, as climate change is, as Ed has suggested, transforming what we're going to be facing in terms of future disasters, the system is already under serious stress. A second weakness, and this is focusing particularly on the United States, is there is a strong political influence on humanitarian response. So we can see this in country allocations. It isn't always based on need. It's often based on short-term political considerations. So we find much less response than is needed in the case of some emergencies, and perhaps more than is needed in others. Clearly, large amounts of humanitarian resources going to Iraq and Afghanistan, where indeed there are serious humanitarian needs, but globally, from all donors, much less going to so-called forgotten emergencies, West Africa being a good example of that, the Niger food emergency of 2005 being sort of the paradigm for that. Also, embassies in the field may ask for a military response even when that may not be the best approach, but for political reasons to show support, could you send a carrier group, may not be the best way to respond to an emergency. Another weakness in the context of climate change is coordination among the various pieces of the U.S. response system is inadequate given the increasing complexity, and coordination will need to improve. In addition to that, we face structural budget issues. Typically, the annual appropriations for humanitarian assistance are inadequate to address, on the one hand, protracted emergencies such as we face not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also Democratic Republic of Congo, Darfur, and several others. To face those, known needs that are multi-year on the one hand through an annual appropriation, and unforeseen circumstances like, let's say, a massive earthquake in Haiti. So resources have to be shifted from the protracted emergencies to meet the sudden unforeseen emergencies. and then a supplemental appropriation is needed to cover the difference. Two other major weaknesses that we see. One is there's not enough attention or resources provided for the relief to development transition. So relief is provided, but the recovery phase, the reconstruction phase, restarting development, this is not well coordinated or managed. There is an Office of Transition Initiatives in USAID, but it isn't as effective as it could be. It is heavily focused, again, on Iraq and Afghanistan, inadequate resources, so another weakness. And finally, and closely related to that one, we see inadequate investment in disaster risk reduction and climate resilience. And we can see over this 6-year period here, about 6%, 8% of all U.S. humanitarian assistance is going to disaster risk reduction. Now, some people may say, well, disaster risk reduction, what do you mean by that? Is that just repackaging development assistance under a new name? You know, is it calling spending investment as kind of a budgetary trick? And the answer is no. Disaster risk reduction covers such things as shifting the type of crop planted, for example, in the face of recurrent droughts, more planting of root crops like, say, potatoes, as opposed to cereals, as we've seen in Ethiopia, and this is detailed in the report. It's also creating programs like microinsurance so that farmers don't lose their assets if a drought strikes or a storm strikes. It's also investing in disaster management capacity, as Bangladesh has done, and we've seen fewer deaths in Bangladesh when storms and floods occur precisely because of the substantial investment. Studies show that the return on disaster risk reduction is about 7 to 1, a pretty good cost-benefit ratio, I'd have to say. Now, on the prevention side of things, another problem is if we break down the shortfalls in humanitarian assistance, we see that appeals for food aid get a much better response from donors, these are global figures in this slide, than the types of response that would build assets, build resilience, linked to disaster risk reduction, such as emergency agricultural assistance, water and sanitation, or health. These are global figures, but U.S. assistance mirrors these. Food aid often is very necessary, but it's also reactive. It's not linked to prevention in the way we would like to see. And there's some structural problems with U.S. food aid, quite well known. I think you're probably familiar with these, but first of all, delivery delays because of legal requirements that the United States use primarily U.S. commodities in its food aid and use U.S. flagged ships. That also increases costs, reduces the tonnage available. We estimate that tonnage could be boosted by 15% given a fixed budget if there was open bidding for shipping services for in-kind food assistance. And there's limited legal authority at the moment to purchase food aid locally and regionally. So this is a lost opportunity to boost local agriculture, to link to agricultural adaptation, and to build resilience. And in contrast to the $1 to $2 billion food aid budget at Food for Peace, AFTA spends about $60 million a year on emergency agricultural assistance. So what do we recommend in the report then to address these problems? First of all, to address the leadership issue, we think that AFTA should be not only the theoretical lead agency, but the lead agency in practice, really managing disaster response, taking the lead, and among other things, this will require enhancing the military liaison program that AFTA already has, but that is, at the moment, under-resourced. Second, we recommend a biennial planning exercise focused on climate-related disasters. This would be an interagency process, and it would absolutely engage that black swan planning capacity that Ed managed that the military has. We also think that long-term security is better served by basing humanitarian assistance on assessed needs, not on short-term political considerations, because politicized humanitarian assistance frequently leads to blowback, and we see this again in Iraq and Afghanistan, where humanitarian assistance becomes identified with one side in a conflict and doesn't contribute to security. Obviously, the budgetary process needs to be reformed so that the trade-off between protracted emergencies and unforeseen emergencies doesn't require a drawdown of resources from one to the other. Adequate funding to address the protracted emergencies upfront in the appropriations is what we call for in the report. Likewise, we think that additional resources are needed for resilience, prevention, risk reduction, and not just a matter of money here, but mainstreaming climate resilience and risk reduction into disaster planning and response. It has to be an integral part, and that includes a timely move from relief to recovery, reconstruction, back to development that is integrating risk reduction moving ahead. And then on the emergency food and agricultural programming side, first of all, expanding the authority, and this would require legislative change for local and regional purchase, better linking food and agricultural assistance to adaptation, risk reduction, resilience building. And then finally, important to make emergency agricultural assistance a bigger part of disaster response because of its ability to preserve livelihoods, keep people on the farm as opposed to moving into IDP camps or refugee camps. Also useful in bridging that transition gap. And finally, again, it's linked directly to addressing climate change through adaptation and resilience building. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you very much, Mark. I think what we'd like to do now is invite our panelists who will give us some additional perspectives. We're going to be joined by Vice Admiral Lee Gunn from CNA, where he is, I should say, retired Vice Admiral. He'll correct me if I didn't mention that. He's president of CNA's Institute for Public Research and vice chairman of CNA's Military Advisory Board. I think a process and a group of retired flag officers that I think many of you know have been very instructive and influential in bringing these issues to the table. Major General Rich Engel, who's also retired, but from the Air Force. Rich is the director of the Climate Change and State Stability Program at the National Intelligence Council. And I think we all know that quite a bit of attention was drawn to this issue with the 2008 assessment of climate change in U.S. national security. Rich was on point on that very extensive effort, and so it's terrific that he can join us today. And then you will notice that it is not Julie Cunin from USAID. Julie called David Waskow this morning and was barely audible given laryngitis. And so Ed Carr was the early USAID arriver who got drafted to take her place. Ed is absolutely appropriate to do that, though, and in fact had extensive conversations with Julie about the report in advance of this. Ed is a geographer from University of South Carolina who is working at AID as a AAAS fellow and leading the charge on climate for the Dacha Bureau, and so brings perspectives from multiple worlds to this discussion, so we're thrilled to have him. Admiral Gunn, why don't we have you kick off our discussion?
Can you bring that up? I think we've got one there.
Okay. I'm not sure that is this the one?
Oh, that's right.
Okay, good. That's terrific, because that's the last one on the screen.
Well, we're all relieved up here. I'm not sure you are out there. Well, that remains to be seen. I'd like to do two things this morning. To focus on the military dimension. I was most impressed, by the way, upon reading the report and looking at its balanced view of the whole of government approach. I think it's worthwhile, though, to talk a little bit about the Military Advisory Board that Paul mentioned. It's a process we've had at CNA, which I think has gotten a group of retired generals and admirals to a point on these same issues that we have the perspective and we have the credibility with which to talk about issues that I know you already believe are important. And in the process, we can move the body of public opinion in the right direction. And so I'd like to talk about the Military Advisory Board, not necessarily who we are, but what we learned in the process we went through and how we reached conclusions about things that are important to national security and therefore the military institution in the future. That's number one. And then I'd like to talk quickly about where I think the military is today. We've had 4 military advisory boards, but the first one dealt with climate change and national security. In 06 and 07, this was a pretty special perspective on this issue. There was a great deal of research. There was beginning to be public controversy about climate change and many of the consequences of climate change that would be faced by our nation and by the people of the world. But there wasn't much conversation about the national security dimension of climate change. And so the group of retired admirals and generals, 15 or so, got together and asked some questions. What are the conditions that climate change is likely to produce? How will they affect our national security, and what action should we take? What should we do about that? So there was a study plan. And the questions that were asked involved looking at the trends, looking at the resulting conditions that were likely from those trends. What were the impacts, in particular, based on our military experience? What were those impacts likely to be in areas where the U.S. military could help and the U.S. military would need to be prepared? And how did those conditions impact the overall national security posture of the United States? And how should the national security community respond? Not just the military, but those other elements of government that we work with. The leader of this first effort was General Gordon Sullivan, former Chief of Staff of the Army, an absolutely super guy who came to this, he said, as a climate skeptic. That is, he was not as informed as he'd like to be about the degree to which and the rate at which climate was changing, and he also was not yet convinced, as many of the members of the MAB were not convinced, that there was a substantial human contribution. Those views changed during the course of this MAB proceeding, and I think that change, the efforts that we went to bring about that change for all of us, is part of those are one of the factors or some of the factors that add to our credibility in this. But there was controversy, in particular in the middle of this last decade, about the science of climate change. And we were challenged often with the notion that the conditions were uncertain that we were facing. And General Sullivan brought the battlefield perspective to this by saying, if we wait until we have 100% certainty on the battlefield, then something bad will already have happened. And in fact, you, the American citizens, we all pay the military to be prepared to deal with the worst. And so it was an obligation on the part of this group and the national security apparatus to be prepared to deal with that. So what did we look at? Well, the things that you all are very familiar with, the threats to life and survival in water and food and health and weather, the places where these kinds of things come together and conspire to make life difficult. We saw the kinds of images that you've seen as well, the ice melt. Here, the point of maximum retreat in the year in 2005 of the Arctic ice cap, and then we compared it to approximately the same period 2 years later. You're all familiar with that. We looked at the regions of the world and started with the Middle East, where a complex network of water agreements, and Paul Faith here from CNA is sitting in the audience, and Paul is working on water issues in relation to the kind of things we're talking about over the course of the months here. And this complex of informal and formal water agreements in the Middle East is necessary and is fragile, but it's necessary because it has to support the needs of people for access to water which originates outside of their borders, and the constant pressures that are associated with livelihoods that cause people to emigrate. In Asia, about 1.3 billion people live in the valleys, in the watersheds of the great Asian rivers. 40% of the people in Asia live within 45 miles of the coast. There's always the threat of inundation, but even without coastal inundation that's substantial to this point, things are happening with regard to the climate. And in China, for example, there is already additional impetus toward movement from the rural to the urban areas because of pressures on food supply and the water supply that are at least in part connected to climate change. So in the river basins of the great rivers of Asia, in particular the Yellow, Yangtze, Mekong, Ganges, and Indus, people depend on these not being seasonal streams, being continuous rivers. And those rivers rely for their year-round source of water on the glaciers. And here are pictures like you've seen before. This was 1975. And this is the part of the year when the glaciers are in the greatest retreat. And here, 20 and a half years later, in the part of the year when at the same place, the glaciers are in their greatest position of advance, that's what remains. In the Western Hemisphere, inundation of the coastal regions is, of course, important domestically for the United States. Extreme weather events are also things that we increasingly will have to deal with. And in the Andes, the northern Andes, situations exist with regard to the glaciers that are very much like those in Tibet for Asia. And migration into the United States, which now is primarily economic, I think, is likely to become more and more associated with climate as well. So for the national security apparatus, for the Defense Department in particular, this is sort of emblematic of the new battleground. I don't want to couch humanitarian assistance and disaster response in battle terms, but that is sort of the way we conceive of things. We have to fight disease, we have to fight hunger, we have to help people struggle to overcome the environments they face. And these are the kinds of conditions which increasingly are going to aggravate those difficulties that people face. And in Africa, as Ed mentioned, weakened governance, economic collapse is often focused there. Human migrations are already underway. And stability, which is one of the charges that you and I give to our military and to our national security establishment, because stability is good for U.S. operations and interests around the world, is threatened. Instability will likely result in those most troubled regions where people will struggle for the food, health, water, safety that is necessary to sustain life. And desperation and hopelessness are conditions we already contend with too often in the world, with a breeding ground to fanaticism. You've seen people like this on the move. These are the places they're often going. This is a refugee camp in northern Kenya, where I was. Where I was, and these are Somali refugees who've fled south. There are other refugee camps like this ringing Somalia on the other borders. These are the kinds of conditions, the unemployment, the hopelessness that often contribute at least to giving rise to the kind of terrorism that we face, not only in the locations where they originate, but where they're exported as well. And ultimately, for a bunch of generals and admirals, these were the people we were worried about. We are looking at a world where conditions will be created in part by climate and in part by the other structural problems we've talked about, with which American young men and women will have to contend. And so at the base of it, that's what the Military Advisory Board, in my view, worries about. So the findings were, we have serious threats here. The term threat multiplier actually came from Military Advisory Board. Number one, where it was used to encapsulate all of these forces. The tensions would increase around the world and even in regions we've considered stable up to now, and that climate change and national security are inextricably linked, and in fact this MAB pointed the way to what the second Military Advisory Board studied, and that was energy dependence. But nothing about that today. I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about the military and as a component of the humanitarian assistance and disaster response today. This comes from the American College of Surgeons, and I thought it was pretty good. Mass mobilization of people and resources in response to something that happens often suddenly. I think that the report that was presented today makes good distinction between the variety of ways that disasters onset, but you deal with people and organizations often that you do not know, and so we invest in the military a lot around the world. I can certainly attest to the Navy and the Marine Corps' investment in learning the regions and learning the people in advance of our need to work together. And that we work in an environment that we don't get to choose. That's another feature of the disaster response and humanitarian assistance. Here are 6 events in which the military figured prominently. It's clear that the military doesn't participate in anything like all or even the majority of the HADR efforts, and yet when those characteristics that are highlighted in the report can be brought to bear, are desperately needed in response, the military is of course a good organization to go to. Operation Sea Angel, by the way, in 1991 was a happy coincidence following a really terrible set of circumstances in Bangladesh. One of the typhoons went into the Bay of Bengal and decimated southern Bangladesh, and the Third Fleet Amphibious Force, 19 ships, a regiment of Marines were headed across the Bay of Bengal and turned north and went in behind the typhoon to help. That's the kind of thing that the military often can do by virtue of being there. And I can't emphasize strongly enough the importance of proximity. And one of the things I believe the American people expect of their disaster response capability around the world is a quick, rapid response, and the military can provide that. And you can see the rest of these here. I put asterisks. I started out to put asterisks by the operations of which CNA was a part, where we had field representatives who were there. Turned out I put asterisks by everything. So just to remind myself to mention that. This is USS Peleliu off the Marshall Islands. Just a few images. We've got a couple of Navy docks here in jungle camouflage who are enjoying providing assistance. Sailors, Marines, soldiers, and airmen like to help, and it's among the most gratifying kinds of things that people do. Here's a Marine providing water in Pakistan to a woman who's brought a jug. And so how institutionalized is all this? Well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullins, started talking maybe 4 years ago, shortly after he became the chairman, about humanitarian assistance and disaster response as being an important feature of what the military needed to provide in the way of tools to the national defense establishment. And then this was formalized in 2010 in the Quadrennial Defense Review, which then resulted in Secretary's guidance. And that meant that the services were to organize, train, and equip to do the things that were supportive of humanitarian assistance and disaster response. These operations continue, and we're proud to be participating in the analysis, the preparations for and the analysis of the results of these kinds of operations for their continuous improvement. As a matter of fact, we're briefing Navy leaders on the Haiti operation today as we speak. I've got a CNA analyst who's sitting in a canoe in Cameroon. We've got a couple of CNA analysts who are in the Caribbean, and my friend Frank Pons in the center is commander of the amphibious squadron helping in Haiti, and Miguel Martinez on the left is one of our CNA analysts. One of the big tools you hear about are the two hospital ships. This is the United States naval ship Mercy, sailing with USS Abraham Lincoln. 900 beds, an extraordinary capability that the Navy maintains. And then as part of that business of staying engaged with people around the world with whom we might have to work when things get tough, this is an ensign from the USS Gunston Hall who's doing navigation drills with the Tanzanian Navy navigation folks. And here, it's the enthusiasm for this goes to the top. This is the commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, Bob Willard, who is in the Marshall Islands with the president and his wife. So we're engaged, we're enthusiastic about this. I share the view that the military has its place, should only be used in those places, and that we should follow the lead of other institutions of government when that's appropriate. But I wanted you to know that this is meaningful for us and that we work hard at it and that we're ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I think I was remiss. Paul O'Brien, who's the Vice President for Policy and Campaigns at Oxfam America, is going to give our closing, but we thought we should have him up here for the Q&A as well, so it's terrific that he's joined the panel. I was remiss in not introducing him at first. General Engel?
These are alive? Okay, great. I'll stay here if that's okay. Is that fine? My remarks will be relatively brief because, as Jeff said, he's pushing people out of their lanes, and he certainly is pushing me out of what's normally my lane. Just to show you how much, I'm going to begin with a little anecdotal story. I have a daughter who's in the United States Air Force. She flies C-17s out of Charleston. And during the Haiti crisis, or the Haiti humanitarian disaster, I kept hearing on the news about country X is going in, country Y is going in, and I kept looking for my, alma mater, the U.S. Air Force. Where are we in this thing? So I wrote a father-daughter kind of electronic mail correspondence to her and asked her if Air Force was engaged in this issue and if she was doing anything in Charleston about, knowing full well that C-17s out of Charleston would be heavily engaged. But there was a little dripping sarcasm in my electronic mail, which, being the smart daughter she is, she picked up in about a millisecond. And at this point, the major general captain relationship, if never existed between father and daughter, went out the window. And she wrote me back a blistering note explaining how the U.S. Air Force had indeed been involved in Haiti and how they had done considerable amount of work out of Charleston. But then she said some things about the press, just did not give them the due credit they deserved. But it was an interesting story, and what I have never forgotten about her description of what they did is the point that was made earlier. They had to go into an airport that essentially was out of control and non-functional and turn that airport into something that could receive tons of material to try and help the people in Haiti. And that was no small task. But it is one of those unique skills that the military can bring to bear to the problem. All right, first of all, I have to also say that to Oxfam and CNA, it's hard to add much to your report. It was very well done. So at best, I can just give a little bit of a tweak from an intelligence community perspective of how we look at this issue. I'm going to do that by talking about two reports that we've written that kind of bear on the problem. One of them is the climate change NIA that Jeff alluded to, and the other one is part of the Global Trends series that we write periodically. One little comment about the climate change NIA. That was really an assignment I got from the first military advisory board. All my buddies, wrote a recommendation that we go off and do this. I've never really forgiven them for that, but that was a byproduct. The bottom line from the combination looking at these two is to try and leave you with the idea that we really are heading towards a perfect storm, a combination of events that's going to make this much more difficult to deal with in the future, and that difficult future will require increased engagement on the part of both the United States and probably the world at large. So what are the trends? In Global Trends 2025 and also in Global Trend 2020, in both of those, we've looked at some demographic things. And the obvious demographic trends are the population of the world's getting larger, probably up towards about 9 billion people in the 2050 time frame, maybe a little bit beyond that. And that's not really the significant thing from a humanitarian disaster point of view, although it just puts more people on the planet to be at risk, but they're more concentrated. People are moving into more urban areas. The urban areas are larger. And in the developing world, where most of this growth is really going to take place, these urban areas do not have inherent high resilient water, food, shelter, or energy infrastructure. So therefore, you have concentrations of people that become more vulnerable to extreme events, be they extreme weather events caused by climate change, or be they earthquakes or other natural phenomena. So that's one of the pressures that's building. From the climate change NIA, we made the observation that indeed this was going to turn out to create a larger number of humanitarian disasters. We actually laid out 4 major types of issues we anticipated coming out of climate change, and Admiral Guns referred to those, one of which was pressures on food sources, pressures on water sources, which would cause people to move, and movement of people in and of itself is not necessarily always a national security issue, but it can be. The third one was damage to valuable infrastructure, and here I think we have historically looked at this as being principally a challenge for the developed world, where the 2 previous ones are more for the developing world, because the developed world has the infrastructure. But of course, as we go through and we see economic development occur throughout the world, more and more we'll see this infrastructure become at risk from extreme weather events. And it was kind of a epiphany for me, at least, when we did the climate change NIA, to realize that what this really means is the infrastructure design criteria has to be dynamic and change, because the climate is dynamic and changing. And that applies not only to what's done for inside the United States, which CEQ and the adaptation folks are doing a great job looking at, but it has to also be done in the developing world, where we're trying to assist other people with putting in new infrastructure. We have to recognize that the design criteria is going to be more challenging. And then the fourth area where climate change will impact humans will be in the area of disease patterns for humans, plants, and animals will change. Dr. Finger, in his testimony, actually called out the humanitarian issue specifically, and he said, as climate changes spur more humanitarian emergencies, the international community's capacity to respond will be increasingly strained. The demands of these potential humanitarian responses may significantly tax U.S. military transportation and support force structures, resulting in a strained readiness posture and decreased strategic depth for combat operations. So the intelligence community is on record saying this type of a problem can indeed impact the United States military. So the perfect storm comes from the combination of demographic trends, concentration of people, and more adverse and probably more intense storms. So what do we do about it? I think the Oxfam report is right on point, and when they CNA Oxfam report is right on point when they describe the necessity for more services and, of course, more resilience to handle it. And I would really like to emphasize the point of resilience. But I would suggest resilience in the developing world is going to be hard to achieve, notwithstanding the challenges that U.S. aid has from all the help they get in trying to do their mission. The issue you're going to face is inside a given country, they're going to have to make tough choices. Do I build 5 weak shelters that protect people from day-to-day weather, or do I build one strong shelter that's going to be able to take an extreme weather event? And I wouldn't want to be in a position of having to make those choices, but that's the type of choice they're going to have to make with finite amount of money, unless we can figure out how to use money much more effectively than we have, which of course is one of the things that's recommended. The second issue is how do we, the U.S. government, in total respond? And here again, I think it is a whole of government response that's necessary to do that, especially for that class of disasters that I would call complex. And this is a case of where the disaster has been so intense that the formal elements of governance have essentially already failed. And when that occurs, not only must the disaster parties figure out how they help human beings immediately cope, they have to figure out how they provide some substitution capability, hopefully in a benign environment, but it could be in a hostile environment, for fundamental core governance issues. And that indeed is a special type of problem, one again which the U.S. military, because of its security, as many people have previously said, brings a unique contribution. From the IC's perspective, our questions are, how do we share our information with people who are trying to help and not cross our own security lines, and how, if there is a security issue, do we properly interface with other people to get the information they have and to help us put together a whole, complete picture for the security environment. This is especially a challenging, special challenge for NGOs and other people that are not normally part of either the Title 50 national security community in the United States or not even part of the U.S. government, because they have to walk a very careful line of how close they get to the U.S. government, particularly how close they get to the intelligence community in terms of not compromising their own security. And that has to be something we think about. We think about in advance. How do we put together open systems where people can put information in, everyone can use information out of them, and there's probably some work that could be done there to think about clever ways to go about and do that. No one said this was going to be easy. The obstacles to better sharing stem sometimes from organization, culture, and varying security procedures, and a lack of trust. And those are all issues that we have to go work. Thank you.
Well, first I'd like to thank CNA and Oxfam for this report and for my fellow panelists' comments, not least in the ways in which their comments in this report reinforces, in fact, many of the efforts and conversations we're having within the agency right now. I work in the DACHA Bureau as the Climate Change Coordinator, and one of the things that we've been bringing online is a program that addresses a number of these issues. To give you a sense of, in fact, the ways in which these are conversant, our internal rationale for engaging on climate change within DACHA is to reduce risk and build resilience for the most vulnerable to reduce the need for future humanitarian intervention. Now, we're doing this specifically to address, in fact, some of the black swan issues that were raised earlier. Climate change is highly unpredictable. I say this as someone who's been engaged in this for about 14 years, as a member of the IPCC now. What worries me most is not actually the things I do know, it's the things that we cannot predict right now. These are the biggest challenges we face. We can't cover everything rigidly. So what we're trying to do is find ways to build programs that give us the flexibility to address unseen challenges as well as the ones that we're dealing with right now. Some of the things that we have to deal with that I think speak to some of the comments you see here. For us, climate change money is relatively new, and we're building relatively new programs, and we're doing this at really, really high speed. Building on strengths we already have inside the agency in disaster risk reduction, in conflict management and mitigation, in democracy and governance, in early warning, in the delivery of food aid, in global climate change, both the adaptation and mitigation sides of this. And one of the big challenges I think we have is to integrate the strengths that we have inside the agency to deal with what, in fact, are very complex issues and complex situations. So we find ourselves engaged in all kinds of different things. Building an evidence base, in fact, for understanding the connection, the causal connection, such as there is one, between environmental or climate change and conflict. We have some correlations, we have some weak correlations. One of the things we need to do is work on understanding that evidence base better, to program better, to work better in this environment. We need to better understand what works best and codify what works best in terms of disaster risk reduction in these kinds of areas. And this is stuff that we're doing ongoing. We're trying to scale into pilot programs that we expect will build up into full-on programming over the next few years. But we're also dealing with really complex questions. Climate change, like I said, brings that to us. So, for example, one of the challenges we face is disaster risk reduction, a challenging environment to work in to start with. But we're doing things like trying to build disaster risk reduction programs for flood risk in watersheds that cross multiple national boundaries. We've never actually worked very hard on integrating our skills in democracy and governance, which work on transboundary issues, our skills in conflict management and mitigation, which would deal with these sorts of issues, and build those right into our disaster risk reduction programs in a way that makes all of them more coherent, more stable, more sustainable over time. And this is stuff, again, that we're working on. And one final point to sort of address what I think is an interesting point about the transition from recovery into development, as it were. One of the things that we're also working on is thinking about how we take things like disaster risk reduction, especially hydrometeorological disaster risk reduction, how that ties into thinking about adaptation. And there are a lot of different ways in which there are very coherent threads that we can draw between these points. The clearest one right now to me, it's just one example, but I think there are many out there, would be a long-standing expertise in the agency on early warning systems for hydrometeorological risk. RainNet, things like FuseNet are out there, which are well established as being very, very good at what they do. and efforts in the adaptation spectrum to build better understandings of how we use climate information for decision makers in a much sort of broader spectrum, how these things might be linked together. We're developing threads that actually can be pulled together over time to create more coherence in these programs. But what we are dealing with is you guys talk about a fluid situation. We're dealing with a fluid situation. We have new money, new programs, but it's a really exciting time to actually be working in the agency on these kinds of issues, because I think there's a lot of things that are going on that are going to address many of these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Ed. And I should have mentioned as part of Ed's introduction, if you haven't seen his new book, Delivering Development, I suggest it. It's one that challenges some of our basic assumptions based on some long-term research he's done. So thank you both for your comments. We have some time now for Q&A and engaging our audience and just seeing who's in the room. I know there's a lot of expertise out there as well as up here. And so why don't we do that? And then, as I said, Paul will have the last word and bring us to a close. We have microphones, my colleagues do, that we ask that you use so that we can hear you, but also, importantly, so the folks online can hear you. I'm sure we will have a number of them, so I ask you just ahead of time if you could be brief. And then one reminder that I should have put up front, because we've heard a little bit of the interference. If you can turn your Blackberries off, it's the downloading of data that causes that problem. So who would like to kick us off? Oh, do we have one up here? Yes, we do. Sorry. Who would like to kick us off? Yes.
Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Harry.
Harry Blaney from the Center for National Policy. I find this an extraordinary, and I thank you very much for a panel on a very tough subject. Actually, it's been around for a few decades. The question I have is a little bit more political. Everybody here is arguing, and which I agree with strongly, the need for more resources, the need for cooperation between agencies, between the government and the NGOs. The question I have is, we have an environment that goes against that. An environment that goes against the idea that we have climate change, against the idea that we should be engaged in international activities abroad, and one in which we want to bring home the resources that make possible American engagement. And I'd like to know from your very smart panel that you've put up here, Jeff, what do you think that impact will be and how one should deal with it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Why don't we take a couple, because I know there'll be a number of questions, and then, but perhaps Admiral Gunn, we'll have you on tap for responding to Harry, in part because the MAB has done a lot of testifying on the Hill and participating in this process. Was there another question down here? No, Lisa, he's got your question? Okay. Terrific. That's the journalist, so good job, Harry. Okay. Yes.
Bob Barnes from the Nature Conservancy. There's a provision pending in the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act creating an ability between Department of Defense and Department of State to pool resources in a sort of a shared responsibility, pooled resources sort of way to address issues that interlap. And my question is whether people are aware in planning for the use of that pending authority, whether the disaster risk reduction, disaster response is part of the contemplated use of this new authority and pooled resources.
Terrific. Thank you, Bob. And another example of bringing the worlds of military experience together with a conservation NGO. Good to see you here, Bob. Ma'am.
Good morning, Helen Santiago Fink, USAID Urban Engineering Team. Traditionally, well, we know the trend towards urbanization, and it's been pointed out by the panel, increased concentration in urban areas with weakness in particularly developing countries' urban cores. Traditionally, though, USAID has been not focused in the urban areas. How do we enhance and ratchet up the urban focus to address climate change issues in urban cores?
Terrific. Why don't we take those three, although we'll call them four since Lisa had the same question as Harry. Admiral, would you like to kick us off?
I've been sitting here imagining how any element of the government could dodge the bullet that is about to be fired. And I'm having a lot of trouble figuring that out. I think even the Defense Department is going to pay a share. I'm not sure it's its share, but it'll be a share of what reductions that we see turn out to look like. On the other hand, 2 points probably are worth making. One is that by casting the climate change issue and its consequences in a national security context, I think we've inherently broadened the base of potential support for sustaining these kinds of activities. So for those of you in the climate community and those of you who are concerned about development and put your energies into that area, the ability to use the national security hook, I think, is there, and to a degree it wasn't before. That's point one. The other point is that for the military piece of humanitarian assistance and disaster response, the things that it's important to do for the entire variety of military missions turn out to also facilitate the preparation for and the execution of HADR. That is, the engagement activities that the services undertake around the world on our behalf, the way that they learn about the regions and develop relationships with the people and end up actually undertaking exercises and events that are less stressful than the ones that will eventually stress this relationship. Those are all preparation activities which I think are going to be valuable. And then the presence mission. Very often the dispersion of American forces around the world and whether or not that dispersion should be reduced is considered only in light of what the potential direct military engagements of those forces might be. And yet it's almost as important, certainly for the purposes of this conversation, to think about the positioning of those forces in proximity to the people who will need our help when that need arises, and the availability then of all that logistics and lift and training and discipline and security apparatus that is available to pave the way for the other instruments of government to come and provide the help that they can and should.
Okay. Mark or Paul, from Oxfam perspective, would you like to jump in?
Well, I'd make 2 points. One, coupled with that, the disaster risk reduction as a way of using limited resources more effectively, more efficiently in response to the two questions about the current environment. I mean, I think that's crucial, and we do have some evidence. Still building up the database, but we do have some evidence on the cost effectiveness of this approach. It ought to be more intuitive than it is. I mean, if you build good shelters in Bangladesh and you have community-based disaster management committees, you'll have fewer people die. That ought to be self-evident, but we're still making the case. But I do think the evidence base is there. On the question about urban areas, not only is climate change impinging on urban areas, but disasters are increasingly found in urban areas simply because the world is urbanizing very rapidly. And I think as a humanitarian agency, Oxfam found that the earthquake in Haiti, which didn't really discriminate between urban and rural, but affected an awful lot of urban people, that it was something new for the humanitarian community. And I think among the adaptations that we have to make is thinking more about the urban context and what that means, and how to grapple with that, and how to engage in disaster management in an urban context. I mean, I think that's an issue that the humanitarian community is discussing. I know Interaction, our trade association of relief and development NGOs, is sponsoring a seminar this week on that very topic, how to address urban disasters. So I think I'm not giving you an answer, but you've raised the right question.
I'll speak to the political challenge in my closing remarks, if
Okay.
I may.
Why don't we collect a few more? We work this side of the room. Gentleman in the back there, Hannah.
Thank you, Frank Kennefic. I'm an infrastructure, economics, agriculture, et cetera, advisor to the NEPAD, New Economic Partnership for African Development, for the last 8 years. I was former career military. I spent 30 years in aid, 10 years with the World Bank. Then they called me back out of retirement to go to Afghanistan in 2003, and I'm still diddling on that, continuing this afternoon. I think to follow up on the young lady's point over here, preparedness, I've been involved in 4 major operations in disasters, including the significant use of the U.S. military in the Guatemala disaster of '76, probably the most successful one Haiti ever did. But there's, in terms of preparedness, I think we cannot overlook something that strikes me with your slides of the glaciers. There were glaciers before, now there's almost nothing. Aid used to have 550 engineers in engineering and probably another 100 to 150 in management and loan officer and capital project position. It was our job then, and as managers, to look at these urban areas and look at these rural areas, and while we were doing development projects, to build in the ability of these things to withstand earthquakes. I think the schools and the farm markets in Guatemala were a prime example. In several towns in the highlands, they were the only building left standing. And they were converted with our military help and medical services into emergency hospitals, et cetera. 1,100 landslides. My point is the aid management and organizational structure before allowed us to work directly through our regular programs with 110 different countries and do this as part of the programming. Today, that's almost non-existent. And I think we need to, in terms of preparedness, go back and look at the issue within the U.S. government of what is now popular, whole of government and committee action versus real action. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Shannon Scribner with Oxfam America. I'm the Humanitarian Policy Manager. And one of the questions I had is about the resilience issue and building up the resilience. I think we focused a little bit, unless I misinterpreted, on communities and building up their resilience. But what about national governments? I mean, what about building up the capacity of national governments to respond to climate change? And how do you do that with the governance issue that was raised? And also, in terms of support, maybe even from Congress as well, when we look at Pakistan and some of the concerns around providing even direct budget support to the Pakistan government during the response to the flood. So just on a question about building up government's national capacity to deal with some of these issues.
Terrific. That's a great question. Why don't we take one more? The gentleman down here.
Hi, how are you? My name is Jake Resnick, and I'm an intern here with the China Environment Forum. Mr. Carr and Dr. Cohen both talked about the transboundary nature of water resources and the fact that conflicts between nation states are dealing with these international water systems. I'm curious for Admiral Gund and all of you, if you could speak specifically to the military response and how we in the future will deal with the international factor, the international water resource issue. Thanks.
Yeah, and particularly, Ed, perhaps in that respect, you can talk about our mismatch of bilateral approach for multilateral problems, which is not just at aid, but across government, how we organize our embassies and such. Who would like to take a crack at some of these? Ed or Rich? You didn't get a chance the last time around, so I'm not going to give you a free pass again.
Too bad. I'll just make a comment on the water one. I think one of the things that U.S. government can do in the water issue is provide potentially a little bit of ground truth to what really exists. In other words, we have, again, this is a whole of government kind of approach, but we have within the U.S. government the skill sets to do good hydrological modeling. And with good hydrological modeling, with some ground truth, if we can get states to admit that their water data is not a state secret, and with a little assistance from remote sensing, we might be able to really persuade one actor in a transboundary case that it's not really another actor withholding water, but it's really not that much water available at all. So having ground truth might be able to avoid conflict in the future. And now that that requires us, the U.S. government, to make a conscious decision in a resource-constrained environment that we want to go down the path and develop these hydrological models and use our finite remote sensing infrastructure to be able to support that kind of a program.
Actually, I think the issue of the water and the issue of government and government capacity are actually probably closely related. The evidence base actually for interstate conflict, that is conflicts between states over water, is incredibly thin, almost non-existent actually if you look at the literature. If you downscale, conflict issues start to pop up within states, but across borders it actually is not. There are more negative cases than positive cases actually in the case of scarcity. So that's one of the things that we've been looking at rather specifically at the agency level, is what is in fact is the evidence base, so we can program based on that evidence base. But that then gets back to issues, I think, at the end of the day, of governance. And this is in fact issues that are right within our Office of Democracy and Governance's wheelhouse. For example, one of the things they've spent a long time on, not necessarily thinking about climate issues necessarily, but in other contexts, is how do you support governments that need to make difficult decisions going forward? I mean, when you're fostering a democracy, but at the same time they're being forced to make very difficult trade-offs that are going to upset some members of their constituency, how do you encourage people or build up capacity to make those kinds of decisions? How do you foster the kinds of civil society that can hold governments accountable, can interact productively with those governments over time in a way that enables these kinds of things? So I think that these are actually closely interrelated questions that we've been working on for some time. We're just mobilizing the skill sets we have in a new way.
Okay. Ed?
Yeah, I think for the country's preparedness question, I think you have to sort of deconstruct that a little bit. I think for natural disasters, FEMA used to and may still have a program for international disaster response training and using the Federal Response Plan, what used to be the Federal Response Plan, as a model for these countries to be able to respond to natural disasters. And the U.S. military being forward and engaging with many of these countries provides an opportunity for some of the natural disaster response planning, the crisis sort of response planning. I think for the complex humanitarian emergencies or the humanitarian assistance situations, I think you really need to work on the development side and the resilience side like we've been talking up here about. But also I think we don't want to lose the perspective that it's not just the particular country. You can also think of it in terms of a regional problem and work on regional networks of response capability and assistance capability so that you have us as sort of the almost like the federal program where the local community is responsible, then they go to the state, then they go to the federal government. You have the individual country, you have the regional partners for that country, and then you have the global community that comes in as the sort of court of last resort if they can't handle it. So I think there's multi-prong approach, and putting together some of these agencies like FEMA, DOD, along with AID and this Department of State would be a potential way to work some of those problems.
Well, just on the water question, to give an advertisement to the program, the report that's put out annually by the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center has discussed transboundary and intra-state water conflicts in many issues. And I think it isn't an abstract proposition, though, because one of the most problematic agreements on sharing water resources is the Nile Treaty, and the government of Southern Sudan, which will become independent soon, has said it's not going to abide by that treaty. It's not a party to that treaty. So Egypt claiming 80% of the Nile resources isn't going to be a lasting proposition, just to give you one example. On the scaling up of resilience, we do talk in the report a little bit about national programs in Bangladesh, Mozambique, and how effective these have been. Oxfam also has a lengthier paper on scaling up community-based disaster risk reduction on our website, and the author, Kelly Hauser, is lurking in the audience there.
Terrific. I should say on the water question, one of the gurus, I think, for all of us, Aaron Wolf from Oregon State University, has done really some of the most comprehensive research on this, will be speaking here both on July 28th in the China context and then July 29th. So there will be an opportunity to engage Aaron and some colleagues at the World Bank in discussion of these issues again under our Resources for Peace project hat. I think we have time for just a couple more questions and then a quick wrap up. So we'll hit this side of the room.
Reverend Jim Ball with the Evangelical Environmental Network. Those of us in the religious community focused on climate change have been trying to get funding increase for international climate adaptation since 2003. And we haven't been very successful. And it's going to be an even tougher slog in the future than we had anticipated. And so this is really just simply a plea to the security community. We need to convince the country, we need your help in convincing the country and Congress that it is in our national interest to help poor countries adapt to climate change.
Yeah. Thanks. Terrific. If you could pass it to John right behind you, and then we'll get two more. Yep.
John McCormick with the Energy Policy Center. Perhaps I could address this question to Dr. McCready. Your map on fragile countries showed that India was about 4 to 7%. I didn't get the other countries, but when I consider that that whole population of South Asia is dependent upon melting glaciers and the monsoon. Now there's a small bit of science being devoted to the impact of the meltback of the Arctic sea ice and the teleconnection of weather that might affect the Asian monsoon. And I think this is something that is not a disaster response need. It is a long-term and perhaps perpetual need to help these Asian countries figure out that water is a common resource that they've all got to cooperate in protecting and preserving.
Thank you, John. Yeah, the short versus long-term connection. Gentlemen, just one row back, and then I think we'll have to give our panelists their final word.
Right, I'm Michael Davidson from the Natural Resources Defense Council. We've heard a lot today about how the U.S. military is working on it, but I was wondering if you could speak a little more broadly to how other militaries are reacting to climate change and if there's potential for international cooperation. You mentioned a lot of Asian issues, and I know that Japan has proposed a disaster risk center that would sort of house some of these activities in cooperation between U.S. and Japan militaries. I wonder if there's other discussions, if General Engel or the others have any comments on that. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Why don't we just work quickly down the floor, and then we'll give Paul the last word. So, Mark, any concluding remarks?
I just would like to say to Reverend Ball, I mean, if we can get the religious community and the security community behind something, it may take a while longer, but I'm optimistic with those forces in the right camp.
Yeah, and just to echo that sentiment, when you use the military, there are a lot of costs, as Admiral Gunn pointed out. There's not just the cost in terms of money, which is very expensive, but there's also a lot of other costs, both psychically as well as with respect to the loss of troops. I think if you're going to see a situation where in the future the troops are going to be used more, the military forces are going to be used more, if there's some way to mitigate that now, you're going to be saving all of those different kinds of costs. And I think that's a potential avenue of arguing for increased funding now in order to mitigate those costs in the future.
I think the history of the use of militaries for disaster release globally is a mixed picture, to be quite honest. And I can't speak to any specific country, but in general, countries will capitalize and support their armed forces for different reasons. Some cases it's for internal stability, some cases it's for very narrow regional stability. In a few cases it's for broader global projections. And even when they choose to go down that path of preparing their military, to the degree to which they consider humanitarian or disaster relief outside of their own borders, I would say that's probably a very small set of countries that really seriously look at that. Most countries would just leverage existing capability were a crisis to arise if they thought they could gain some soft power advantage from it, which quite frankly it does have a certain value all its own. So I think the trend line, if one looks at the way militaries are being supported for global support for these activities from militaries, I would not be very optimistic about that trend line.
I think that last comment is very fair. General Ingalls got it right. There are a couple of interesting exceptions. The first one is the UK. The British Royal Navy in particular and the Royal Marines are very active in this area, as are the other elements of the British Ministry of Defense. We also have an interesting opportunity, which we've taken advantage of for the last 15 years with the Russians, to build confidence between the U.S. and Russian military. There aren't many occasions when you can do that, but we're using a humanitarian set of scenarios to run an annual exercise, cooperation from the sea with the Russians. It's the U.S. Navy and the Russian Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps and the Russian Naval Infantry. You can use a benign scenario like that and encourage cooperation. You can even imagine occasions when we would be able to go into things like that together, and this is good preparation. So aside from that, though, the militaries of the world are largely not, to my knowledge, devoting appreciable effort to the areas we're talking about today. I just wanted to mention one other thing. It was on the water question. It was a great question, and it elicited a lot of comments up here. I think it's worth mentioning that it illustrates, among other things, the limitations of the military instrument in dealing with this. The question was, what were we doing to prepare to deal with the consequences? Well, the military does deal largely with consequences, and so the fact that all of the remedies that had to do with resilience and preparation and prevention were whole of government, and the natural flow of the conversation had the military at the end of the option set. It's exactly right. That's where we belong.
Well, I certainly know better than to challenge flag officers sitting to my right on anything, so I'm not going in that direction. But I would point out that we live in a world of the emergence of new donors, especially South-South donors, and I have no idea how that would interact with those countries' militaries longer term, so it's something worth thinking about. And in a personal level, Reverend, please come to South Carolina. We could use some mobilization down there on this front.
Paul will give you the final word in the closing remarks.
First, thanks to you and the Wilson Center. This has been a great event, and thanks for your help in bringing together such an esteemed group of panelists, and thanks to all of you for your thoughtful comments. I do want to share a couple of thoughts with you as we try to bring this together. I always love it when Oxfam engages with the military and thinking about some of these challenges, because I actually think there's a lot in common in our cultures. We face two fairly similar challenges. The first is that we know that on our best days, we have to think long term. We have to think intergenerationally. But both of our communities are constantly challenged by the short-term ghettoism of life and what others want from us. On the humanitarian side, we're being asked to count the outputs and tell people what we delivered today. On the military side, there are lives that are being threatened today, and we have to do everything we can to protect them. But at the same time, we know that in our best moments, we're thinking about saving lives a generation from now, be it from a developmental perspective or from a military perspective. The second challenge that we face together is that we have often a real challenge connecting the dots for people, to explain why it is we need to think generationally. And this has to be one of the be-all and end-all dot-connecting challenges. And that's why we have to think about this as a political challenge as well as an empirical reality. And we know what the empirical reality is, right? The facts are in. There was a survey this morning that was on the radio. 97% of scientists agree that climate change is a reality. Here's the frightening part that was in the poll this morning. Only 13% of Americans knew that. When they were asked, what do scientists think? The overwhelming majority think the science is all over the place. They don't know that the scientists are connecting the dots, and we're not yet sufficiently connecting the dots for them. Because Americans in those same surveys do trust scientists. If they know the facts, they trust them. 1996, I think, no, it was 2006, only 5 years ago, over 3/4 of Americans believed that global warming was a reality. Today, it's just over half. We've lost 1/4 of the American public in being able to connect those dots. So I think that is the political challenge, and it's one that's shared between our two communities. For us, the facts are more about what's going to happen to people on the ground overseas from a developmental mindset, right? We've just launched a big report and a new campaign that says 2 decades from now, because of population growth, because there's going to be more demand for food, growth in middle-income countries, we're going to see perhaps a doubling of food prices. We think because of climate change, it could be tripling in the next 2 decades. We've got to take that fact, that story, we've got to bring it to life and bring it home to people so that they start to realize how this affects their own lives. I do think that that means the 2 recommendations of this report are spot on. If we are going to connect the dots for folks, 1, we're going to have to think about leadership, and we're going to have to think about telling a simple and coherent story. That's one reason why we want OFDA clearly up front and in the lead. They are one of the great success stories of U.S. development and humanitarian response over the last couple of decades. They're a strong agency. They've got lots of capacity. We want clear leadership from them and for them, supported by the military, so that everybody knows who to listen to. That's one. The second thing we want, I couldn't agree more with the Vice Admiral and the Major General. It's a challenge to talk about resilience overseas. This is helping people make the investments when we know invest $1 now, it'll save $7 later. Yes, it makes sense. We've got some great stories in the report, but really a light bulb has to go on. We've got to help the light bulb go on for people in terms of understanding why make these investments. And that's why I think this discussion and some of the questions that you've asked from the floor are absolutely key. I think over the next few years, if we can have a discussion, I have to say, this is a proud moment for me. In 2 weeks' time, hopefully, I'm going to become an American citizen, joining my daughter, who's already an American citizen. I'm very excited about this. It's a big moment in my life. It's been a long time coming. I believe if we are going to connect the dots for people, we're going to have to reconnect this climate change discussion to American values. I want my daughter to have a better life than I had. That's why I came to America. That's the American dream. I want others to understand that when we talk about climate change, we're talking about the American dream. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about faith. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about the American economy intergenerationally. And yes, in the end of the day, we're talking about peace for our kids. If we can connect those dots, we have a chance of changing over time the political discussion in the United States. And we know we will eventually, because climate change isn't going away. It's about when. And if we keep having conversations like this, it'll be sooner rather than later. So thanks very much for coming.
Certainly very hard, and I won't even try to follow Paul's remarks that send us forward with lots of energy and understanding how these issues are connected. Thank you all very much for excellent questions. Thank you, our panelists, even those like Ed Carr who didn't know they were panelists till they came this morning, for jumping in admirably. Join me in thanking our guests in this discussion today.